What's up, my comic comrades? The X-Men have been looming large for the past few months between X-Men 97, several brand new titles in Marvel Comics, and the massive part they're about to play in the highly anticipated Deadpool and Wolverine. And one of the most important X-Men in all of it is Charles Xavier, aka Professor X. In fact, as the founder of the X-Men, Xavier is one of the most important and popular characters to ever hit the pages of a comic. So it's high time we gave the good professor his due with the history of Professor X. And if you dig today's episode, do us a solid and hit the like button, drop a comment below, and share it with everyone you think might dig it too. All of those things help to tell the YouTube algorithm to show the video to more people. But before we dive in, you guys have to check out today's sponsor, PowerUp. They have created the first smartphone-controlled paper airplane for both kids and adults. They sent us over a couple of planes to check out, and these things are wild. To be specific, we have the PowerUp 4.0 with the Tornado, F-22 Raptor, and Dragon add-ons. I mean, look at this. Each of these are piloted via Bluetooth to your phone and have great stability. The plane's onboard computer even calibrates for imperfect weather. It also has rapid charging with a 30-minute quick charge, giving you 10 minutes of flight time in a range of up to 230 feet. I don't know about you, but when I used to make paper airplanes, they didn't always survive a nosedive landing. But PowerUp models are made from a crazy durable carbon fiber body that includes a nylon reinforced nose and motor mount, which means it'll be able to survive our terrible pilot skills and we'll still be able to fly it with our kids. Not to mention, these bad boys make for a great gift. It's always hard to find something cool and entertaining for friends and family, but PowerUp is a fun gift for birthdays, Christmas, elementary and middle school graduations, you name it. You can grab one for yourself or pack away a few as gifts today at poweruptoys.com/variant. And when you use our link, you'll automatically get 20% off your entire order. Just click the link in the description to get yours today. Professor X, aka Charles Xavier, first appeared in the X-Men issue 1 in September of 1963. He was created by the great Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The inspiration for Charles Xavier was Martin Luther King Jr., which is very apparent as Xavier's whole mindset is to try to peacefully change the human's prejudice against mutants. But with that said, let's break down the comic book origin of Professor X. It was given to us back in X-Men issue 12 in the early 60s, which also is the first appearance of the Juggernaut. So in the issue, Xavier gives his origin via a flashback. He does this because of the new threat towards the X-Men at the time, the unstoppable Juggernaut. He tells the X-Men he is his brother. He then shares his story saying it started with an atomic blast years ago at Alamogordo, New Mexico. I'll never forget that fateful Holocaust, for my father was killed in the blast. We see him at his mother's side at his father's funeral, with Xavier saying to himself, if only Dad had been able to escape the blast the way Dr. Marco did. Dr. Marco then tries to comfort Sharon, Xavier's mom, saying, I know how you feel, Sharon, and I share your grief, but as his friend, I shall look after you and after the boy too. As Xavier says, even though he was Dad's fellow scientist, I never trusted Dr. Marco, and I don't trust him now. Months later, Marco persuaded Xavier's grief-stricken mother that Xavier needed a father to take care of him. Xavier says, though it filled my heart with a nameless dread, they were finally married. Captions from Xavier say, even as a boy, my mutant brain let me sense secrets which were locked in the minds of others. As we see Marco say, at last, now I have everything I've always dreamed of. With Xavier thinking, money, power, that's all he really cares about. As time went on, Marco was a horrible stepfather. He was mean to Sharon and Xavier, putting his work before his new family. Xavier's mom tells him, I've been a fool. You never really cared for me. You just wanted the power our wealth could bring you. Marco has no problem admitting it, saying, ever since I can remember, your husband had everything. Fame, success, the admiration of the world, while I was a nobody, but things are different now. The next day, Xavier would meet Kane, his stepbrother, who he described off the bat as having an aura of sheer cruelty. Kane tells Xavier, if you're wondering what I'm doing here, I just got expelled from school. I decided there wasn't anything else those creeps could teach me, as he smacks Xavier in the head. Later, Xavier hears Kane implying to his father that Xavier's father's death was no accident, and he knows how he inherited his wealth, trying to blackmail his father for money. Kane's father gets extremely pissed, saying, don't you ever say that again. Do you hear me? As Xavier comes in to confront them both, asking, what did you mean by that? What really happened to my father during the atomic bomb test? Kane gets pissed off, saying, no bratty stepbrother is going to cause trouble now, knocking over chemicals, but this causes a fire. The fumes from the chemicals in the fire cause Marco to die, but with his dying breath, he tells Xavier, Charles, your father's death was an accident, but I might have saved him if I tried, but I didn't. Forgive me. Beware of Kane when he finds out about your power. Xavier continues to say, it wasn't long after Marco's death that I realized my brain possessed powers which must have been caused by all the radiation my parents had been exposed to at the Nuclear Research Center before I was born. The only outward sign was the fact that I began to lose my hair while still in my teens. More important than that was my fantastic ability to think. As I grew older, my ESP power made me excel at everything. I became a star quarterback because I always knew in advance what the enemy tackles were thinking. Even at track, I had the advantage of knowing when an opposing runner was tiring or planning to make his last desperate spurt. But all the while, Kane Kane Marco was watching and hating, his jealous heart filled with almost uncontrollable envy. So much envy, Kane would snap, attacking Charles and breaking several of his trophies. Charles then says the final tragedy occurred when Kane offered to drive me to college after vacation. Hoping to win his friendship, I accepted. But during the drive, Xavier says, "You're driving like a madman. We'll never stay on the road." Kane says, "You're better than I in sports and studies and almost everything. But now I've got the top hand. I'm going to drive like this until you beg me to stop." Kane then accidentally drives the car off the side of a cliff. However, Xavier, being the good heart that he is, uses his mental power to help Kane leap to safety while he remained in the car a split second too long. The X-Men asked, "Is that how you lost your use of legs, Professor?" He replies, "No, that happened another time at the hands of a man you know as Lucifer. I managed to survive the crash by harnessing my brain power to its fullest extent by creating a mental shield around me. Though I was badly hurt, I lived." But I know what some of you are wondering: how did Charles lose the use of his legs? We find out in X-Men issue 20. He lost his ability to walk when the villain Lucifer dropped a giant stone on him, paralyzing him. Flash forward to X-Men issue 38. In the back half of the issue, in a story called A Man Called X, Charles Xavier at his mansion gets the newspaper and while reading says, "So it's come at last. The thing I knew one day must happen. The human race have discovered the presence of mutants in their midst." According to this account, the FBI is beginning a special investigation as of today. Then I dare play the role of a recluse no longer. I must leave for Washington at once. The time has come to act, to end self-imposed exile. By the end of the issue, Xavier tracks down the FBI agent in charge of the investigation, Fred Duncan. He proposes to them, "I can help you and the human race by tracking down myself the mutants in this country." They would scarcely trust an outsider, but perhaps one of them. Duncan goes for it, saying, "I gotta admit, it might just work. We have some leads on who some of the mutants are, but we haven't figured out how to approach them." Xavier says if they're hounded, persecuted, they may band together and become the very menace that you fear. Duncan says, "Okay, Xavier, you sold Fred Duncan. We'll supply you with the info we have and you report at intervals to us." Xavier shakes their hands, saying, "Excellent, Agent Duncan. I'll keep in touch regarding my progress. Let us hope we have both reasoned correctly. On us may depend the survival of all humanity." Then in issue 41, we see the first mutant that Xavier tracks down and saves is Scott Summers, aka Cyclops. The short of it is, he tracks Scott down, who was being led astray by the mutant the Living Diamond, and ultimately takes Scott under his wing, recruiting him to be the first member of the X-Men. Xavier starts his team of mutants with Scott to help save the world and show that mutants are an ally, not a threat. But there you have it, friends, the origin of Charles Xavier. So with all that said, let's move on to story arcs and publication history. Now, obviously one of the best Professor X stories ever told, and certainly one of the most iconic, is in the first issue of X-Men, X-Men 1 from 1963. This is the series that started it all. On the very first page, in the very first panel, we see Professor X with the comic saying, "In the main study of an exclusive private school in New York's Westchester County, a strange silent man sits motionless, brooding alone with his incredible thoughts. Finally, his meditation comes to an end. Then when he remains completely motionless, a sharp commanding thought rings out, echoing through the great halls of the building." As we get the first line of Professor X dialogue in an X-Men comic. Professor saying, "Attention X-Men, this is Professor Xavier calling. Repeat, this is Professor X calling. You are ordered to appear at once. Class is now in session. Tardiness will be punished." So not only is Professor X the first character we see inside of an X-Men comic, but he is also the first character to ever speak in an X-Men comic. Speak may not be the right word, but you get what I'm saying. After this, we are of course introduced to the original X-Men lineup: Cyclops, Iceman, Angel, Beast, and a few pages later, Jean Grey. Again, this is the introduction of Professor X and his X-Men, so we see him making them train in the Danger Room as he tells them, "You'll receive your grade tomorrow." This establishes Xavier off the bat as the teacher, founder, father figure, mentor, and heart of the X-Men. Next, and only briefly because we just went over it, we have X-Men issue 12. This is the issue that gives us the origin of Professor X. We learn what happened to his father. We learned about his relationship to his stepbrother Kane Marco, who would become Juggernaut. We also see how he dealt with getting his mutant abilities into his adulthood. All this ultimately leading to future issues that we went over in Origins, where we saw he would later work with the FBI and form the X-Men. So moving along, we have Uncanny X-Men 321. This is an epic story because it shows us Charles and Eric, aka Magneto, working together in their early years in Israel. We see the two talking about Homo superiors, aka mutants, and if they really exist. And if they do, would they be able to coexist with Homo sapiens? Charles believes they can, while Eric says Homo superiors, if they exist, will need to stake a hard claim to the world if they expect to survive, establishing off the bat the paths they would each go down. This exact issue was actually adapted for the X-Men 97 Season 1 finale. At the very beginning of the episode, we get a flashback of a scene very similar to this. Xavier and Eric are talking in a bar in their early years, and Xavier tells Eric he's a mutant, at which point Eric also reveals to Xavier he is a mutant too. The scene isn't exact, but it is certainly inspired from issue 321. As for the actual issue, a fight breaks out in the bar, but Charles and Eric, being mutants, are able to make quick work of the men. At one point, someone tries to hit Charles with a chair, but he says, "Unfortunately, I am a hard man to surprise." Eric gets in on the fight, saying, "My friend has his hands full at the moment. Perhaps you better deliver your message to me." Eric thinks the man going after Xavier will back down, but he's wrong, at which point he says, "Apparently, I was mistaken. Good. My friend learned to fight in the Orient. He is a gentleman. I am not as cultured." As he knocks out the dude who just punched him and is trying to get to Xavier. The two then fight back to back, with Eric saying, "And you dreamed of a world without violence." Xavier says, "Any dream worth having, Eric, is a dream worth fighting for." Long story short, the two make easy work of about a dozen men. We also have X-Men 114, which introduces Charles Xavier's sister, Cassandra Nova, who will be making her live-action debut in Deadpool and Wolverine. We've talked about her a while ago and even did a whole episode about her, so check this episode out right here if you want to know more about her. To cut to the chase, this is the introduction of Charles Xavier's long-lost sister, who we find out isn't necessarily his twin sister in the way you think she would be, but the evil side of Charles Xavier that manifested itself to wreak havoc and get rid of all mutants. Moving along, we also have House of X, which basically gives us the new and current rendition of Professor X, who is wearing Cerebro on his head at all times and is now able to walk. It also establishes Xavier more like Magneto in a few ways, which is certainly different from the past. We also have the New Avengers Illuminati series, which shows us Professor X as part of the Illuminati. Essentially, the Illuminati are made up of the most important and influential people in the Marvel Universe, and Xavier is certainly one of those people, as he's the representative of the mutant community and the leader of the X-Men. The issue reveals the members of the Illuminati and their formation after the Kree-Skrull War. Clearly, I could keep going forever. There's no shortage of Professor X comics and storylines, but we're going to end with Uncanny X-Men 161, which is famous for being one of the best stories that explores the relationship between Professor X and Magneto. It basically gives us a deep dive on their extremely complicated relationship. A lot of X-Men movies pulled from this to get the dynamic of the characters right, which is not shocking. This is a classic written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Dave Cockrum. It's certainly an issue that will forever be thought of as one of the best Professor X and X-Men issues of all time. But let's also give you a brief history of Professor X in the X-Men movies. It all started back with the first X-Men movie in the year 2000. It introduced us to Patrick Stewart, which is probably one of the best castings for any comic character ever. He is Professor X. Then in 2003, we got X2, X United, arguably the best X-Men film ever made still to this date, especially if you're a 90s or early 2000s kid. The thing I liked about the first two X-Men movies the most is how much it dealt with Professor X and Magneto's point of view on how humans and mutants should coexist. In a lot of ways, these movies have shaped the way we look at characters like Professor X. Moving on to the franchise's third installment, we have X-Men The Last Stand. It wasn't the best, but hey, I'm actually kind of fond of it. Call it nostalgia, but I get down with it, even though it's clearly the worst of the original trilogy. But if you're just talking about specifically Charles Xavier, this is the movie where we get his death by the hands of the Phoenix Force and Jean Grey. And let me tell you, he goes out like a boss. Super calm and with a bit of fatherly advice, simply telling Jean, don't let it control you. Then after this, the franchise got rebooted in 2011 with X-Men First Class, with James McAvoy as Professor X. Here we got to see a young Professor X and how he lost his ability to walk, at least in his movie version. We learn while Magneto is deflecting gunfire, one of the rounds accidentally goes into Charles' spine, paralyzing him. It's a really good take on the incident, as Magneto is horrified at what he just did to his friend. We then get X-Men Days of Future Past in 2014, where we get to see Patrick Stewart, Charles Xavier, meet his younger self, James McAvoy. It's a really epic moment to see the icon Patrick Stewart, Professor X, give advice to his younger self, James McAvoy, Professor X, who took over the role for the new X-Men movie franchise. It's also just a really touching scene, seeing someone's older self give advice to their younger self. Then of course, we got X-Men Apocalypse in 2016, which honestly, I haven't seen in a very long time, but I don't remember digging it too much. But I do remember James McAvoy was great. I mean, James McAvoy is a really good Professor X, and he's just an amazing actor overall, so that's not shocking. Moving on, we have possibly one of the best Professor X movie appearances, and that of course is in Logan from 2017. This movie is basically just all about Logan and Professor X, and it's absolutely brilliant. Now you may be asking how Xavier is alive in Logan if he was killed in X-Men The Last Stand. Well, the timeline was changed in the Days of Future Past movie, and Xavier's death was erased. The point is, Xavier is amazing in Logan, and Logan is just fantastic. Unfortunately, we get to see Professor X die yet again in this movie, and it's heartbreaking every time. Then we would get James McAvoy, Professor X, once again in 2019's Dark Phoenix. which is not the best X-Men movie to say the least. But last, and certainly not least, we saw Patrick Stewart reprise his role as a different version of Professor X in his iconic 90s yellow hover chair in Multiverse of Madness. And I have no doubt we're gonna see Professor X cameos in Deadpool and Wolverine, which I cannot wait for. But that wraps up his appearance in movies, so let's keep this going with his powers and abilities. Now, Professor X is one of the most powerful telepaths in all the Marvel Universe. He has telepathy, he's able to mind read, mind control, cast mental illusions, alter someone's memory, sense the presence of other mutants or individuals of enhanced minds. He can even cast mental bolts to knock out opponents. But besides that, he has astral projection. He can project his actual form onto the astral plane, which allows him to travel without his physical body and interact with astral beings. He also has a psychic shield around him to protect them from telepathic attacks. Professor X also has a genius-level intellect, being an expert in various fields such as psychology, biophysics, and genetics. Not to mention, he is an extremely skilled tactician and strategist, given that his brain is literally his superpower. He's one of the best leaders in all the Marvel Universe, being the founder, leader, teacher, and mentor at the School for Gifted Youngsters, and more importantly, the X-Men, the most elite group of mutants in the Marvel Universe. And being that he's a genius, he's also a fantastic inventor, being able to build various types of technologies to help mutant kind, most notably Cerebro, which amplifies telepathic abilities to detect any and all mutants in the world. Essentially, his primary power is his mind and leadership skills. He is easily one of the most important characters Marvel has to offer. As for reading recommendations, check out X-Men issue 1, the New Avengers Illuminati series, the New Mutants issue 26, X-Men Legacy issue 208, House of X series, and Uncanny X-Men 161. That should be enough to get all of you started. And that wraps up our history of Professor X. Let us know your thoughts on this legendary founder of the X-Men and what role you think he might play in the MCU in the comment section below. Other than that, we will see you next time when we talk about all things comics.